shorter time, so I'm going to ask 3 questions in a row, and you'll answer them, and we'll probably collect 3 or 4 in a row, and because that's what we do when we run out of time at Stanford, okay? So I want to start with Giovanni. You mentioned, all of the speakers mentioned the refugee issue and the immigration, the fact that there's natural growth after a sort of secondary bounce that comes after immigration. And I'm wondering to what extent we're trying to solve the refugee problem, that is people afraid of Syrian refugees or different kinds of Muslim refugees, and solve the sort of demographic second bounce of the expansion of the population with an economic immigration policy. In other words, we've conflated a lot of different things, but now people are trying to put up a wall to deal with that. So I'd be interested in what the statistics are on refugees and that sort of secondary bounce. With Felicia, I've read in the papers that there's real concern in a lot of immigrant communities, particularly those that have participated in DACA or that have revealed their information to the courts, that now you've handed over to a very strict enforcement possibility all the information they need to find people and deport them. So is there a kind of betrayal of trust there, or are there any protections in terms of the information that was given, or are they indeed exposed as I've read? And then with Doris, I want to ask a question that's possibly relevant in California, which is what happens when law enforcement decides that it's not going to cooperate in finding people and deporting people? What can happen in that kind of situation? Have we had it before? So why don't we start and go down the line, and then I will collect questions outside.
Yeah, so in the refugee issue, I would distinguish, honestly, the European versus the American situation. Europe has a real emergency right now with the millions of Syrians who are in refugee camp in Jordan, in Lebanon, and who, I think in any logical world, some of them will find a way into Europe, and Europe is fighting this very hardly, maybe with the exception of Germany. Refugees in the world are about 10% of total migrants, so you cannot think of solving problem with refugees. Refugees come for a humanitarian reason. I also think that the Central American refugees, which is a very new phenomenon with children, quantitatively is not going to be such a big issue as the economic migrants. So I think we were talking about 55,000 refugees, Syrian refugees in the United States, which is a drop in the bucket, really relative to the 1.1 million people who are coming every year legally in the United States. So I do think that for the US, priority number 1 is to reform the legal system so that we deal with our family reunification and with the economic migrants, and investing more in a efficient refugee admission is going to be important, but not as quantitatively significant. Europe needs to deal with the refugee in a much more serious way because the Middle East will have several of them. Yes, so that to me tells that the next wave of refugees will not come from Latin America, which is undergoing a massive fertility transition, and maybe not even from Asia, which also is undergoing. Middle East and Africa are the countries which have a much more still young population, and I think this, again, is going to be more of a European problem than a United States problem because they're closer and more connected. That's the next thing we need to talk about in the world if we want to plan ahead.
Okay, very good. Felicia?
So the question about DACA and confidentiality issues, I mean, it's a question we have been grappling with since in the last month, and have been hearing from people quite a bit about this issue, fear in the community. I will say that there are not a lot of tools, to be frank, that we can, where we can shield categorically information from ICE and from CBP, from enforcement officials, from the folks that have processed DACA petitions, DACA requests, USCIS. There are, and that is difficult, and that's a difficult reality that we're facing right now. And as we talk to the community of people who support these programs and this policy, it kind of lends itself to even more urgency for people who do support DACA and the benefits, and understand and see the benefits of it, to make their voice heard to talk to policymakers about the very unintended consequences that could come from an elimination of DACA. There are gradations for what they could do. Obviously, they could say they're going to stop the program altogether and allow people to have their status just naturally run its course and have people fall out of status. They could say from this day forward, we will not let anyone else into the program. They could say we are going to try to take steps to turn that information over to law enforcement officials. I would say that ICE has its hands full on the Central American migration issues and the effects that it has on their work. Not sure exactly how that would play itself out. There are longstanding policies around how USCIS shares information with ICE and other officials in the law enforcement community. There's a memo, a very wonky memo called the Notice to Appear Policy Guidance, which kind of lays out the contours of how that information is shared. And we've pointed out to people that memo would likely have to shift in some way. There are also going to be due process protections for people if they are subject to removal. They're likely to be given an opportunity to appear in court, and there will be legal services providers outside of government who are likely to be incredibly busy if they were to actually try to move on individuals. It's not entirely comforting because some people would prefer that we find a way to eliminate a database, but we can't do that. We took an oath and we have to obey the law, and this is the law in the books. But there are a number of tools, I think, in place, and we've been trying to educate people about those tools, and also, hopefully, people outside of government like Todd and others are working to mobilize the educators, business community, faith community, so many others, mayors and local officials who are mobilizing and hopefully going to educate the next group of policymakers.
Okay, Doris?
On sanctuary cities, I actually want to pick up from what Felicia said, because I think that reality has set in, and hopefully it'll set in more fully with the incoming administration. They have said that their focus is on deporting criminals. They've used a number that is larger than we think the number actually is, but still, even with what they're talking about, that's a very important first priority. DACA people don't fit into that at all. These are the furthest from people who would be criminals, which is what their focal point is. And frankly, the mobilization and the rumpus that's being kicked up through the university community as well as everywhere else about DACA is a pretty good insurance policy that would not be a high priority for deportation, even if they do decide to withdraw DACA. On sanctuary cities in general, it's a fascinating collision course that's underway, because the degree to which a new administration does want to increase the numbers of criminals that it's going to deport, it must have cooperation from law enforcement in cities. That's where the numbers are, that's where people live. And so I just give you one number that's very clarifying. There are about 360 jurisdictions in the country that have declared themselves in one form or another having sanctuary policies. There are a whole gradation of what these policies are. But those jurisdictions represent 53% of the unauthorized population that lives in this country. So unless you have cooperation between local communities, everywhere as big as Los Angeles and New York to as small as Garden City, Kansas, you're not going to be able to do any real ramp up in deportations of criminals. Ultimately, Congress has to decide whether funding in any important amounts can be withheld. The administration can withhold some funding. There are some funds right now that flow, but the kind of funding withholding that they're talking about as a hammer has to be congressional. And there have been bills on this issue for the last 2 or 3 years that a Republican Congress has not been able to agree on in terms of the funding. So this will not be easy.
Okay, so let's gather some questions. Tell us who you want to direct the question to, and so they can remember. And we'll go out to 3 or 4. So let's start with David Kennedy.
So, Doris, I'd like to address this question to you, please, and take you back to the distinction you drew. Others did too, but you dwelled on it the longest between citizenship and legal status. And I agree with your position that the notion of citizenship as the goal of policy has been the single greatest obstacle to formulating a policy. So let's focus on the path to legal status as distinguished from citizenship. I want to ask you to be specific. What would be the attributes of legal status that would define the rights and privileges and responsibilities of that status in ways that satisfy the needs and aspirations of the immigrant people themselves and were politically viable in the Congress?
Okay, let's go back here. Second question. There you go, right there. Yeah. Is there a third question? We can get a mic to you while we're waiting. Third question right here. Well, we got two, Pat and right here.
The question is to Felicia and Doris. I'm
Keep your
cheating
hand up.
there. I would like to ask, and it's a very fundamental question, to what degree is the shibboleth of what is come to see the elite left as of multiculturalism is not at the base of the problem, in the sense that assimilation is now considered awful and multiculturalism is celebrated. Would that be, I want your guys to respect, you two esteemed people to reflect on that. Is that an issue that has made the politics of it just, that goes to Todd's point, that the numbers shouldn't add the way they do, but they do?
Okay, let's go right in front here.
I'm not sure that I need to specify who the question's directed to.
Okay.
Several people have touched on it. Question relates to what do we do going forward. We've talked a lot about the challenges of legalization versus citizenship and so forth, but we've talked also about how the resources are really strained in terms of what we do with particularly the children that are coming across the border. The real challenge, it seems to me, is the southern border of Mexico and not the northern border of Mexico. I don't know whether the numbers we saw, the 20,000 and the 140,000 in the two time frames in terms of net migration, but it's clear that the bulk of the problems today in terms of additional illegal are people using from Central America, particularly the Northern Triangle, using Mexico transient country. So the question is, does it make any sense to try and work with Mexico to help them shore up their southern border as opposed to talking about building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border?
Okay, very good. And the last question.
Two premises and a question. The first premise is the question's coming from a Irish Catholic Democrat who's a resident of Utah, so I tend to see dark things. Second, Professor Kurt Steiner was my professor in Stanford in Austria in 1968, 30 years after he and his wife had to leave Austria during the Anschluss. We often talked about what could have been done perhaps to avoid some of the problems. So with that as a premise, what political signs or actions in D.C. with the new administration would move you personally to become civilly and non-violently disobedient?
We'll probably end on that one, huh? Okay, so we have a question about legal status from David Kennedy, one on assimilation and one on the southern border of Mexico, and then we get to who's willing to go to jail for this.
Okay, so David, on a legal status, there's been some work done with people in the unauthorized population. What do they really want? And what they really want is to be able to work legally, a work permit, and they want to be able to travel so that they can go to their grandmother's funeral and visit their parents, whom they haven't seen for 15 years. So what I outlined, pass a criminal background check, authorization to work, ability to travel, and with that, by definition, comes protection from deportation, unless you commit a criminal act. That would make an enormous difference. And it isn't the full way, but it would raise it would have positives in so many directions. Can I pick up on the issue? No?
Go ahead. No. She's just reminding me what I already know, which is time is expiring. Okay, so
No, that's why
let's do the assimilation. There was an assimilation question. Anybody want to handle that? Or?
So I mean, I can start. I think that assimilation versus multiculturalism versus integration and multiculturalism. I actually think that some of what Todd pointed out about this issue is relevant here. So when you go to, so we have something called the White House Task Force on New Americans. We created it in November 2014 when we did a bunch of other things that people found more controversial, so they didn't focus on it. But the task force is a federal interagency task force that has been focused on, trying to do a better job at the federal level in having an integration strategy, but also supporting states and localities that want to invest in policies that bring people together versus create fear and hate. Basically. And what we've seen at the local level, and this is the same as what you see in the refugee issue, at the local level, there is a lot of support for actually where people are going. There is a lot of support for multiculturalism, creating communities where you recognize people's differences and you celebrate them. It's the American way in so many ways, right? And so we see a lot more support for that than what ends up getting talked about in sound bites and what ends up in the political rhetoric. Where that, there's certainly tensions. Frankly, where the tensions are the greatest are where immigrants aren't actually moving to. And that kind of goes to Todd's point about the Midwest and the Rust Belt. There's obviously some immigration there, but in the communities where immigrants and refugees are actually going, there is a lot of support. And there's certainly that 20% out there across the country, but there is a lot of support. So, from my perspective, the work that we've done actually has only underscored the amount of support out there. It doesn't get talked about. It's not as sexy because it's not about fighting and conflict, but is actually there. There's always been, and the president talks about this quite a bit, I mean, we all know in our history there's always been some pushback and some tension around whether the next group is going to assimilate or integrate as quickly as possible. That will always be there, and that is a tension that happens as immigration increases as a percentage of the population, and it ebbs and flows. But I frankly think that there is more support for it than we see right now because of the people who have drowned out the folks that do support
Felicia, on the question of the southern border, did the southern border of Mexico issue come up in your circles as you would think?
Yes, so I mean, we actually do a lot of work with Mexico on all of their migration challenges. We are supporting them on the southern border. We're also supporting them in their infrastructure for a refugee system and a refugee process because they have good laws in the books, but their process is not actually in reality isn't actually in place as strongly as it could be. So we do work with them quite a bit, provide technical assistance. I mean, in order to do some of the things that maybe you were referencing, hardcore support of actually funding to support, technology, things like that, that actually would take some changes in the law. And would have to go through Congress, but we could certainly, and we have, worked to support their efforts. But they also have to grapple with this mixed flows issue because it's not just the case that everyone needs to be turned back, but there is a way to make it work, I think.
And I think the question about going to jail we'll give to Todd.
It's just funny.
So,
no, it's really funny you say that because I'm like a white political guy who works in the immigration space with a bunch of activists, and like the ongoing joke in my organization is no one's allowed to get arrested until I give them permission. And then over the last couple of weeks, it's turned into I'm excited we're all going to get arrested together someday. Before I answer that question, though, I just wanted to say the legalization versus citizenship thing is a really, really, really interesting point because there's this. There are two things where there's this public opinion gap between elite consensus and this. This is a huge point in Washington, D.C. And like the dirty little secret is that like the 2013 Senate bill with a pathway to citizenship was going to turn into a legalization but not citizenship bill in the House. But if you ask the public, they don't care. There's no difference. It's fascinating. There's like a 3-point difference. Almost all from the Republican Party, but it's only a small gap with Republicans. The other elite consensus is this, and I'll leave everybody here, is the least popular part of immigration reform, of border security, pathway to citizenship, low-skilled ag worker is the fourth thing of should we be increasing the numbers of scientists and engineers who come here to fulfill high-skilled jobs? And the reason for that is because of this huge percentage of America who doesn't think, who just sees, like the world in front of them. Our eyes are designed and our brains are designed to deal with perception from the plains, the savannah of like, there's an animal, how do I get to it or away from it? And kind of abstract concepts of growth versus a zero-sum mentality don't naturally come to people. And high-skilled immigration, which is like, has unbelievable benefits and elite consensus, is not particularly popular with the American public compared to a pathway to citizenship, which people equate with low-skilled immigration. And so I leave that as something to like a challenge to people to think about. Now, a challenge to me is, what do I do when someone comes to my office and they have got the DACA list, they have the address of where my staff live, and they have a cell phone number, and because if you're on DACA, you're not a citizen or a legal permanent resident, they will have the ability, and there will be lawsuits over this, but like, kind of to Felicia's point, at the end of the day, like the law seems relatively clear, I think, and if we, have friends who sue in the other way, so don't take me saying this, but they can ping a cell phone, and they can come find 750,000 kids who just want to contribute. I think the question of, are we going to be a nation that turns on people who just want to come here in large scales in the era of social media, and that is the defining question as we move forward. And as somebody who thinks long and hard about it as a bipartisan organization and we can constructively engage, not just being a person, not just being somebody who is a voice yelling, is the way I think we can most make a policy change. Standing in front of people who are friends and not willing to step aside, though, as a human being, look, I'm like a Jewish guy from St. Louis, and like, I went to a fancy school, and if they can come and people can grab and have to go through me, it makes it harder to get other people. So that's kind of how I do that question. I'm happy to do that.
Okay, well, I think we should thank the panel for a very informative discussion, and we're going to take a break for 15 minutes.